Hello and welcome to this series of videos where I will explain to you the relationship between religion and society at large. Now, one of the first things that I would like to explain is about this trendy way of understanding the generations. Uh, we cannot deny that, in fact, there are really differences between the generations and how it is affected by their contemporaneous culture. Now, in the Philippines, I think particularly in this year of the youth, which is being celebrated by the Catholic Church, it has become so trendy to talk about the young. And by the way of understanding the young is by using the sociological tool which we call as the generational nicknames. Example of this are, for example, the baby boomers, the Generation X or X, Generation Y, Generation Z, millennials, the woke generation, among many other nicknames. And recently I've read about the alpha generation. So we got barely over with the Generation Z, and now here comes another nickname, the alpha generation. So it's so fast. And one of the ways by which we try to cope with this is through seminars and talks that talk about these generational nicknames. Now, I would not explain the generational nicknames, but I would like to propose to you a way of understanding in terms of the principles. How do we really take this into consideration, and how do we understand this handy way of describing a generation? Most often, it is the attitude of Filipinos that whatever is being imported is good. Or sometimes we are not even discerning whether it is valid, whether it is true, whether it is coherent. All we do is just, if it is trending, then that must be true, which is very faulty. Now let us look at the generational nicknames. One of the most important things that we have to remember before we subscribe completely to this handy way of describing the generations is that these nicknames and the generation that is described have a particular cultural context. So the culture affects the generation, and that is, I think, a principle that we should agree. In other words, if I am going to describe an American teenager, or shall we say, to be more precise, an American millennial and an American Z generation or an American Alpha generation, it would have a difference from a Filipino millennial or a Filipino Generation Z or a Filipino digital native or a Filipino Alpha generation. It is not a one-size-fits-all typology. And that is the problem that oftentimes is being neglected by those who propose such kinds of categorization or typologies. Most often, the results of American cultural studies are being imported to the Philippine cultural context, which is far different. You cannot say that the description of an American millennial is the same as that of a Filipino millennial. So that is the reason why also that I am insisting, for example, in my own talks and homilies, that we should not take these researches hook, line, and sinker, because we need to have an understanding of what it is to be a Filipino. Or rather, to be more precise, we have to discover how our own Filipino culture affected our generations. It would be absurd to think that there is no connections at all, and that there is this particular standard or universal uniformity among the generations across cultures, which is very, very difficult to believe in, because, as I said, cultures influences the generations. So, my dear friends, the lesson that I would like to share in this particular video is this: do not take the descriptions of so-called millennials as if it is a one-size-fits-all description. It is not. An American millennial is different from a Filipino millennial. An American digital native is different from a Filipino digital native. So I think the Filipino sociologists and those who are interested in the interface between culture and religion needs to study how our own unique Filipino culture affects our younger generation. Thank you. For our next video, which I would play, or rather which I would broadcast later, we will talk about the principles by which we should be able to have a clearer understanding of these generational differences.